Short story we're going to read tonight is called Sticks by Karl Edward Wagner. I'm reading it off the Karl Edward Wagner short story collection, In a Lonely Place. Today's background art that you see there is the piece Sticks by Karl Edward Wagner, Part 3 by MHUWCARR on DeviantArt. At least that's who it appears to be from. Hopefully that's not, a re-upload, or hopefully that's the original artist. It seems to be that way, but you know how DeviantArt is. And it begins like this. Sticks. The lashed together framework of sticks jutted from a small cairn alongside the stream. Colin Leverett studied it in perplexity. Half a dozen odd lengths of branch, wired together at cross angles for no fathomable purpose. It reminded him unpleasantly of some bizarre crucifix, and he wondered what might lie beneath the cairn. It was spring of 1942, the kind of day to make the war seem distant and unreal, although the draft notice waited on his desk. In a few days, Leverett would lock his rural studio, and wonder if he would see it again, be able to use its pens and brushes and carving tools when he did return. It was goodbye to the woods and streams of upstate New York, too. No fly rods, no tramps through the countryside in Hitler's Europe. No point of putting off fishing that trout stream he'd driven past once, exploring back roads of the Estelic Valley. I've got a cruise he can fix? Oh my God. Man Brook, so it was marked on the old Geological Survey map, ran southeast of De Ruyter. The unfrequented country road crossed over a stone bridge old before the first horseless carriage, but Leverett's Ford eased across and onto the shoulder. Taking fly rod and tackle, he included a pocket flask and tied an iron skillet to his belt. He'd work his way downstream by a few miles. By afternoon, he'd lunch on fresh trout, maybe some fat bullfrog legs. It was a fine, clear stream, though difficult to fish, as dense bushes hung out from the bank, broken with stretches of open water, hard to work without being seen. But the trout rose boldly to his fly, and Leverett was in fine spirits. From the bridge, the valley along Man Brook began as fairly open pasture, but half a mile downstream the land had fallen into disuse and was thick with second-growth evergreens and scrub apple trees. Another mile and the scrub merged with dense forest, which continued unbroken. The land here, he'd learned, had been taken over by the state many years back. As Leverett followed the stream, he noted remains of an old railroad embankment. No vestige of tracks or ties, only the embankment itself, overgrown with large trees. The artist rejoiced in the beautiful drywall culverts spanning the stream as it wound through the valley. To his mind it seemed eerie, this forgotten railroad running straight and true through virtual wilderness. He could imagine an old wood burner with a conical stack steaming along through the valley, dragging 2 or 3 wooden coaches. It must be a branch of the old Oswego Midland Railroad, he decided, abandoned rather suddenly in the 1870s. Leverett, who had a memory for detail, knew of it from a story his grandfather told of riding the line in 1871 from Ostelig to De Ruyter on his honeymoon. The engine had so labored up the steep grade over Crum Hill that he got off to walk alongside. Probably that sharp grade was the reason for the line's abandonment. When he came across a scrap of board nailed to several sticks set into a stone wall, his darkest thought was that it might read, "No trespassing." Curiously, though, the board was weathered featureless. The nails seemed quite new. Leverett scarcely gave it a thought, until a short distance beyond he came upon another such contrivance. And another. Now he scratched at the day's stubble on his long jaw. This didn't make sense. A prank, but on whom? A child's game? No, the arrangement was far too sophisticated. As an artist, Leverett appreciated the craftsmanship of the work, the calculated angles and lengths, the designed intricacy of the maddeningly inexplicable devices. There was something distinctly uncomfortable about their effect. Leverett reminded himself that he'd come here to fish, and continued downstream. But as he worked around a thicket, he again stopped in puzzlement. Here was a small open space with more of the stick lattices and an arrangement of flat stones laid out on the ground. The stones, likely taken from one of the many drywall culverts, made a pattern, maybe 20 by 15 feet, that at first glance resembled a ground plan for a house. Intrigued, Leverett quickly saw this was not so. If the ground planned for anything, it would have to be for a small maze. The bizarre lattice structures were all around, sticks from trees and bits of board nailed together in fantastic array. They defied description. No two seemed alike. Some were only one or two straight sticks lashed together in parallel or at angles. Others were worked into complicated lattices of dozens of sticks and boards. One could have been a child's treehouse. It was built in 3 planes, but was so abstract and useless that it could be nothing more than an insane conglomeration of sticks and wire. Sometimes the contrivances were stuck in a pile of stones or a wall, maybe thrust into the railroad embankment or nailed to a tree. It should have been ridiculous, but it wasn't. Instead, it seemed somehow sinister. These utterly inexplicable, meticulously constructed stick lattices spread through a wilderness where only a tree-grown embankment or a forgotten stone wall gave evidence that man had ever passed through. Leverett forgot about trout and frog legs, instead dug into his pockets for a notebook and stub of pencil. Busily, he began to sketch the more intricate structures. Perhaps someone could explain them. Perhaps there was something to their insane complexity that warranted closer study for his own work. Leverett was roughly 2 miles from the bridge when he came upon the ruins of a house. It was an unlovely colonial farmhouse, box-shaped and gambrel-roofed, fast falling into the ground. Windows were dark and empty. The chimneys on either end looked ready to topple. Rafters showed through open spaces in the roof, and the weathered boards of the walls had in places rotted away to reveal hewn timber beams. The foundation was stone and disproportionately massive. From the size of the unmortared stone blocks, its builder had intended the foundation to stand forever. The house was nearly swallowed up by undergrowth and rampant lilac bushes, but Leverett could distinguish what had been a lawn with imposing shade trees. Farther back were gnarled and sickly apple trees and an overgrown garden, where a few lost flowers still bloomed, wan and serpentine from years in the wild. These stick lattices were everywhere. The lawn, the trees, even the house were covered with the uncanny structures. They reminded Leverett of 100 misshapen spider webs, grouped so closely together as to almost ensnare the entire house and clearing. Wondering, he sketched page on page of them as he cautiously approached the abandoned house. He wasn't certain just what he expected to find inside. The aspect of the farmhouse was frankly menacing, standing as it did in gloomy desolation where the forest had devoured the works of man. Where the only sign that man had been there in this century were these insanely wrought latticeworks of sticks and board. Some might have turned back at this point. Leverett, whose fascination for the macabre was evident in his art, instead was intrigued. He drew a rough sketch of the farmhouse and grounds, overrun with the enigmatic devices, with thickets of hedges and distorted flowers. He regretted that it might be years before he could capture the eeriness of this place on sketchboard or canvas. The door was off its hinges, and Leverett gingerly stepped within, hoping that the flooring remained sound enough to bear his sparse frame. The afternoon sun pierced the empty windows, mottling the decaying floorboards with great blotches of light. Dust drifted in the sunlight. The house was empty, stripped of furnishings other than indistinct tangles of rubble mounted over with decay and the drifted leaves of many seasons. Someone had been here, and recently. Someone who had literally covered the mildewed walls with diagrams of the mysterious lattice structures. The drawings were applied directly to the walls, crisscrossing the rotting wallpaper and crumbling plaster in bold black lines. Some of the vertiginous complexity covered an entire wall, like a mad mural. Others were small, only a few crossed lines, and reminded Leverett of cuneiform glyphics. His pencil hurried over the pages of his notebook. Leverett noted with fascination that a number of the drawings were recognizable as schematics of lattices he had earlier sketched. Was this then the planning room for the madman or educated idiot who had built these structures? The gouges etched by the charcoal into the soft plaster appeared fresh, done days or months ago, perhaps. A darkened doorway opened into the cellar. Were there drawings there as well? And what else? Leverett wondered if he should dare it. Except for streamers of light that crept through cracks in the flooring, the cellar was in darkness. "Hello?" he called. "Anyone here?" It didn't seem silly just then. These stick lattices hardly seemed the work of a rational mind. Leverett wasn't enthusiastic about the prospect of encountering such a person in this dark cellar. It occurred to him that virtually anything might transpire here, and no one in the world of 1942 would ever know. And that in itself was too great a fascination for one of Leverett's temperament. Carefully he started down the cellar stairs. They were stone and thus solid, but treacherous with moss and debris. Hi! Oh, hi! Hello! Oh, we're just a few pages in. Welcome, welcome. We're in a scary house. And that in itself was too great a fascination for one of Leverett's temperament. Carefully he started down the cellar stairs. They were stone and thus solid, but treacherous with moss and debris. The cellar was enormous, even more so in the darkness. Leverett reached the foot of the steps, paused for his eyes to adjust to the damp gloom. An earlier impression recurred to him. The cellar was too big for the house. Had another dwelling stood here originally, perhaps destroyed and rebuilt by one of lesser fortune? He examined the stonework. Here were great blocks of gneiss that might support a castle. I think that's pronounced nice. I think I looked that up and it's pronounced nice. On closer look, they reminded him of a fortress, for the drywall technique was startlingly Mycenaean. Like the house above, the cellar appeared to be empty, although without light, Leverett could not be certain what the shadows hid. There seemed to be darker areas of shadow along sections of the foundation wall, suggesting openings to chambers beyond. Leverett began to feel uneasy, in spite of himself. There was something here, a large table-like bulk in the center of the cellar. Where a few ghosts of sunlight drifted down to touch its edges, it seemed to be of stone. Cautiously, he crossed the stone paving to where it loomed. Waist-high, maybe 8 feet long and less wide. A roughly shaped slab of gneiss, he judged, and supported by pillars of unmortared stone. In the darkness, he could get only a vague conception of the object. He ran his hand along the slab. It seemed to have a groove along its edge. His groping fingers encountered fabric, something cold and leathery and yielding. Ugh, mildewed harnessed, he guessed in distaste. Something closed on his wrist, set icy nails into his flesh. Leverett screamed and lunged away with frantic strength. He was held fast, but the object on the stone slab pulled upward. A sickly beam of sunlight came down to touch one end of the slab. It was enough. As Leverett struggled backward, and the thing that held him heaved up from the stone table, its face passed through the beam of light. It was a lich's face, desiccated flesh tight over its skull. Filthy strands of hair were matted over its scalp. Tattered lips were drawn away from broken, yellowed teeth, and sunken in their sockets, eyes that should have been dead were bright with hideous life. Leverett screamed again, desperate with fear. His free hand clawed the iron skillet tied to his belt. Ripping it loose, he smashed at the nightmarish face with all his strength. For one frozen instant of horror, the sunlight let him see the skillet crush through the mold-eaten forehead like an axe, cleaving the dry, fresh, and brittle bone. The grip on his wrist failed. The cadaverous face fell away, and the sight of its caved-in forehead and unblinking eyes, from between which thick blood had begun to ooze, would awaken Leverett from nightmares on countless nights. But now Leverett tore free and fled, and when his aching legs faltered as he plunged headlong through the scrub growth, he was spurred to desperate energy by the memory of the footsteps that had stumbled up the cellar stairs behind him. When Colin Leverett returned from the war, his friends marked him a changed man. He had aged. There were streaks of gray in his hair. His springy step had slowed. The athletic leanness of his body had withered to an unhealthy gauntness. There were indelible lines to his face, and his eyes were haunted. More disturbing was an alteration of temperament. A mordant cynicism had eroded his earlier air of whimsical asceticism. His fascination with the macabre had assumed a darker mood, a morbid obsession that his old acquaintances found disquieting. But it had been that kind of war, especially those who had fought through the Apennines? I don't know that one. Leverett might have told them otherwise, but he cared to discuss his nightmarish experience Leverett might have told them otherwise had he cared to discuss his nightmarish experience on Man Brook. Sorry, I lost my place. But Leverett kept his own counsel, and when he grimly recalled the creature he had struggled with in the abandoned cellar, he usually convinced himself it had only been a derelict, a crazy hermit whose appearance had been distorted by the poor light and his own imagination. Nor had his blow more than glanced off the man's forehead, he reasoned, since the other had recovered quickly enough to give chase. It was best not to dwell upon such matters, and this rational explanation helped restore sanity when he awoke from nightmares of that face. Thus Colin Leverett returned to his studio, and once more he plied his pens and brushes and carving knives. The pulp magazines, where fans had acclaimed his work before the war, welcomed him back with long lists of assignments. There were commissions from galleries and collectors, unfinished sculptures and wooden models. Leverett busied himself. But there were problems now. Short stories returned to cover painting as too grotesque. The publishers of a new anthology of horror stories sent back a pair of his interior drawings. Too gruesome, especially the rotted, bloated faces of those hanged men. A customer returned a silver figurine, complaining the martyred saint was too thoroughly martyred. Even Weird Tales, after heralding his return to its ghoul-haunted pages, began returning illustrations they considered too strong, even for our readers. Leverett tried half-heartedly to tone things down, found the results vapid and uninspired. Eventually, the assignments stopped trickling in. Leverett, becoming more the recluse as years went by, dismissed the pulp days from his mind. Working quietly in his isolated studio, he found a living doing occasional commission pieces and gallery work, from time to time selling a painting or sculpture to the major museums. Critics had much praise for his bizarre, abstract sculptures. The war was 25 years history when Colin Leverett received a letter from a good friend of the pulp days, Prescott Brandon, now editor-publisher of Gothic House, a small press that specialized in books of the weird fantasy genre. Despite a lapse in correspondence of many years, Brandon's letter began in his typically direct style. The Erie/Salem, Mass, August 2. To the macabre hermit of the Midlands. Colin, I'm putting together a deluxe 3-volume collection of H. Kenneth Allard's horror stories. I well recall that Kent's stories were personal favorites of yours. How about shambling forth from retirement and illustrating these for me? We'll need 2 color jackets and a dozen line interiors each. Would hope that you can startle fandom with some especially ghastly drawings for these, something different from the hackneyed skulls and bats and werewolves carting off half-dressed ladies. Interested? I'll send you material and details, and you can have a free hand. Let us hear. Scotty. Leverett was delighted. He felt some nostalgia for the pulp days, and he'd always admired Allard's genius in transforming visions of cosmic horror into convincing prose. He wrote Brandon an enthusiastic reply. He spent hours rereading the stories for inclusion, making notes and preliminary sketches. No squeamish sub-editors to offend here. Scotty meant what he said. Leverett bent to his task with maniacal relish. Something different, Scotty had asked. A free hand. Leverett studied his pencil sketches critically. The figures seemed headed in the right direction, but the drawings needed something more. Something that would inject the mood of sinister evil that pervaded Allard's work. Grinning skulls and leathery bats? Trite. Allard demanded more. The idea had inexorably taken hold of him. Perhaps because Allard's tales evoked that same sense of horror. Perhaps because Allard's visions of crumbling Yankee farmhouses and their depraved secrets so reminded him of that spring afternoon on Man Brook. Although he had refused to look at it since the day he staggered in, half dead from terror and exhaustion, Leverett perfectly recalled where he had flung his notebook. He retrieved it from the back of a seldom-used file, thumbed through the wrinkled pages thoughtfully. These hasty sketches reawakened the sense of foreboding evil, the charnel horror of that day. Studying the bizarre lattice patterns, it seemed impossible to Leverett that others would not share the feeling of horror the stick structures evoked in him. He began to sketch bits of stick lattice work into his pencil roughs. The sneering faces of large degenerate creatures took on an added shadow of menace. Leverett nodded, pleased with the effect. Okay, that's about the halfway point, I think, for the short story. So I'm going to take take 5 right here. Probably not 5 whole minutes, but this is going to be our break point. I'm going to use the bathroom. And then we're going to go ahead and finish it. And like I said, not a terribly long one tonight. You know, we're not starting a new book, so it's to be expected. So I'll see you guys in just a minute. Okay, now the crickets are funny. That's good. Let me type something real quick. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Some months afterward, a letter from Brandon informed Leverett that he had received the last of the Allard drawings and was enormously pleased with the work. Brandon added a postscript. For God's sake, Colin, what is it with these insane sticks you've got poking up everywhere in the Illos? The damn things get really creepy after a while. How on earth did you get onto this? Leverett supposed he owed Brandon some explanation. Dutifully, he wrote a lengthy letter, setting down the circumstances of his experience on Man Brook, omitting only the horror that had seized his wrist in the cellar. Let Brandon think him eccentric, but not a madman and a murderer. Brandon's reply was immediate. Colin, your account of the Man Brook episode is fascinating and incredible. It reads like the start of one of Ellard's stories. I've taken the liberty of forwarding your letter to Alexander Steffroy in Pelham. Dr. Steffroy is an earnest scholar of this region's history, as you may already know. I'm certain your account will interest him, and he may have some light to shed on the uncanny affair. Expect first volume, Voices from the Shadow, to be ready from the binder next month. Pages looked great. Best, Scotty. The following week brought a letter postmarked Pelham, Massachusetts. A mutual friend, Prescott Brandon, forwarded your fascinating account of discovering curious sticks and stone artifacts on an abandoned farm in upstate New York. I found this most intriguing, and wonder if you can recall further details. Can you relocate this exact site after 30 years? If possible, I'd like to examine the foundations this spring, as they call to mind similar megalithic sites of this region. Several of us are interested in locating what we believe are remains of megalithic construction dating back to the Bronze Age, and to determine their possible use in rituals of black magic in colonial days. Present archaeological evidence indicates that circa 1700 to 2000 BC, there was an influx of Bronze Age peoples in the northeast from Europe. We know that the Bronze Age saw a rise of an extremely advanced culture, and that as seafarers they were to have no peers until the Vikings. Remains of a megalithic culture originating in the Mediterranean can be seen in the Lion Gate in Mycenae, in Stonehenge, and in dolmens, passage graves, and barrow mounds throughout Europe. Moreover, this seems to have represented far more than a style of architecture peculiar to the era. Rather, it appears to have been a religious cult whose adherents worshipped a sort of Earth Mother, served her with fertility rituals and sacrifices, and believed that immortality of the soul could be secured through internment in megalithic tombs. That this culture came to America cannot be doubted from the hundreds of megalithic remnants found and now recognized in our region. The most important site to date is Mystery Hill in New Hampshire, comprising a great many walls and dolmens of megalithic construction, most notably the Y Cavern Barrow Mound and the Sacrificial Table, see postcard. Less spectacular megalithic sites include the group of cairns and carved stones at Mineral Mount, subterranean chambers with stone passageways such as Petersham and Shutesbury, and uncounted shaped megaliths and buried, quote, monks' cells throughout this region. Of further interest, these sites seem to have retained their mystic aura for the early colonials, and numerous megalithic sites show evidence of having been used for sinister purposes by colonial sorcerers and alchemists. This became particularly true after the witchcraft persecutions drove many practitioners into the western wilderness, explaining why upstate New York and western Massachusetts have seen the emergence of so many cultist groups in later years. Of particular interest here is Shadrach Ireland's Brethren of the New Light, who believed that the world was soon to be destroyed by sinister, quote, powers from outside, and that they, the elect, would then attain physical immortality. The elect who died beforehand were to have their bodies preserved on tables of stone until the, quote, old ones came forth to return them to life. We have definitely linked the megalithic sites at Shutesbury to later unwholesome practices of the New Light cult. They were absorbed in 1781 by Mother Anley's Shakers, and Ireland's putrescent corpse was hauled from the stone table in his cellar and buried. Thus, I think it probable that your farmhouse may have figured in similar hidden practices. At Mystery Hill, a farmhouse was built in 1826 that incorporated one dolmen in its foundations. The house burned down circa 1848 to 55. Shaker shout out. That's correct. I saw that too. And there were some unsavory local stories as to what took place there. My guess is that your farmhouse had been built over or incorporated a similar megalithic site, and that your sticks indicate some unknown cult still survive there. I can recall certain vague references to lattice devices figuring in secret ceremonies, but can pinpoint nothing definite. Possibly they represent a development of occult symbols to be used in certain conjurations, but this is just a guess. I suggest you consult Waite's Ceremonial Magic or such to see if you can recognize similar magical symbols. Hope this is of some use to you. Please let me hear back. Sincerely, Alexander Steffroy. There was a postcard enclosed, a photograph of a 4.5-ton granite slab ringed by a deep groove with a spout, identified as the sacrificial table at Mystery Hill. On the back, Steffroy had written, "You must have found something similar to this. They're not rare. We have one in Pelham removed from a site now beneath Quabbin Reservoir. They were used for sacrifice, animal and human, and the groove is to channel the blood, into a bowl, presumably." Leverett dropped the card and shuddered. Steffroy's letter reawakened the old horror, and he wished now that he had let the matter lie forgotten in his files. Of course, it couldn't be forgotten, even after 30 years. He wrote Steffroy a careful letter, thanking him for his information and adding a few minor details to his account. This spring, he promised, wondering if he would keep the promise, he would try to relocate the farmhouse on Man Brook. Spring was late that year, and it was not until early June that Colin Leverett found time to return to Man Brook. On the surface, very little had changed in 3 decades. The ancient stone bridge yet stood, nor had the country lane been paved. Leverett wondered whether anyone had driven past since his terror-sped flight. He found the old railroad grade easily as he started downstream. 30 years, he told himself, but the chill inside him only tightened. The going was far more difficult than before. The day was unbearably hot and humid. Wading through the rank underbrush raised clouds of black flies that savagely bit him. Evidently, the stream had seen severe flooding in past years, judging from piled logs and debris that blocked his path. Stretches were scooped out to barren rocks and gravel. Elsewhere, gigantic barriers of uprooted trees and debris looked like ancient and moldering fortifications. As he worked his way down the valley, he realized that his search would yield nothing. So intense had been the force of the long-ago flood that even the course of the stream had changed. Many of the drywall culverts no longer spanned the brook, but sat lost and alone, far back from its present banks. Others had been knocked flat and swept away, or were buried beneath tons of rotting logs. At one point, Leverett found remnants of an apple orchard groping through weeds and bushes. He thought the house must be close by, but here the flooding had been particularly severe, and evidently even those ponderous stone foundations had been toppled over and buried beneath debris. Leverett finally returned back to his car. His step was lighter. A few weeks later, he received his response from Steffroy to his reported failure. Excuse me. Forgive my tardy reply to your letter of 13 June. I have recently been pursuing inquiries which may, I hope, lead to discovery of a previously unreported megalithic site of major significance. Naturally, I am disappointed that no traces remained of the Man Brook site. While I tried not to get my hopes up, it did seem likely that the foundations would have survived. In searching through regional data, I note that there were particularly severe flash floods in the Ostelic area in July 1942 and again in May 1946. Very probably your old farmhouse with its enigmatic devices was utterly destroyed, not very long after your discovery of the site. This is weird and wild country, and doubtless there is much we shall never know. I write this with a profound sense of personal loss over the death 2 nights ago of Prescott Brandon. This was a severe blow to me, as I am sure it was to you and to all who knew him. I only hope that the police will catch the vicious killers who did this senseless act, evidently thieves surprised while ransacking his office. Police believe the killers were high on drugs from the mindless brutality of their crime. I had just received a copy of the 3rd Allard volume, Unhallowed Places, a superbly designed book, and this tragedy becomes all the more insupportable with the realization that Scotty will give the world no more such treasures. In sorrow, Alexander Steffroy. Leverett stared at the letter in shock. He had not received news of Brandon's death. had only a few days before opened a parcel from the publisher containing a first copy of Unhallowed Places. A line of Brandon's last letter recurred to him, a line that seemed amusing at the time. Your sticks have bewildered a good many fans, Colin, and I've worn out a ribbon answering inquiries. One fellow in particular, a Major George Leonard, has pressed me for details, and I'm afraid I told him too much. He's written several times for your address, but knowing how you value privacy, I told him simply to permit me to forward you any correspondence. He wants to see your original sketches, I gather, but these overbearing occult types give me a pain. Frankly, I wouldn't care to meet the man myself. Mr. Colin Leverett? Leverett studied the tall, lean man who stood smiling in the doorway of his studio. The sports car he'd driven up in was black and looked expensive. The same held for the turtleneck and leather slacks he wore, and the sleek briefcase he carried. The blackness made his thin face deathly pale. Leverett guessed his age to be in the late 40s by the thinning of his hair. Dark glasses hid his eyes, black driving gloves his hands. Scotty Brandon told me where to find you, the stranger said. Scotty? Leverett's voice was wary. Yes, we lost a mutual friend, I regret to say. I'd been talking with him just before. But I see by your expression Scotty never had time to write. He fumbled awkwardly. I'm Dana Allard. Allard? His visitor seemed embarrassed. Yes, H. Kenneth Allard was my uncle. I hadn't realized Allard left a family, mused Leverett, shaking the extended hand. He'd never met the writer personally, but there was a strong resemblance to the few photographs he had seen. And Scotty'd been paying royalty checks to an estate of some sort, he recalled. My father was Kent's half-brother. He later took his father's name, but there was no marriage, if you follow. Of course. Leverett was abashed. Please, find a place to sit down. And what brings you here? Dana Allard tapped his briefcase. Something I'd been discussing with Scotty. Just recently, I turned up a stack of my uncle's unpublished manuscripts. He unlatched the briefcase and handed Leverett a sheaf of yellowed paper. Father collected Kent's personal effects from the state hospital as next of kin. He never thought much of my uncle or his writing. He stuffed this away in our attic and forgot about it. Scotty was quite excited when I told him of my discovery. Leverett was glancing through the manuscript, page on page of cramped handwriting with revisions pieced throughout like an indecipherable puzzle. He'd seen photographs of Allard manuscripts. There was no mistaking this. Or the prose. Leverett read a few passages with rapt absorption. It was authentic and brilliant. Uncle's mind seems to have taken an especially morbid turn as his illness drew on. Dana hazarded. I admire his work very greatly, but I find these last few pieces, well, a bit too horrible. Especially his translation of his mythical Book of Elders. It appealed to Leverett perfectly. He barely noticed his guest as he pored over the brittle pages. Allard was describing a megalithic structure his doomed narrator had encountered in the crypts beneath an ancient churchyard. There were references to elder glyphics that resembled his lattice devices. Look here, Dana pointed. These incantations he records here from Alori Zorkos' forbidden tome. Yogth, Yugth, Suthrath, Yog. Hell, I can't pronounce them, and he has pages of them. This is incredible, Leverett protested. He tried to mouth the alien syllables. It could be done. He even detected a rhythm. Well, I'm relieved you approve. I'd feared these last few stories and fragments might prove a little much for Kent's fans. Then you're going to have them published? Dana nodded. Scotty was going to. I just hoped those thieves weren't searching for this. A collector would pay a fortune. But Scotty said he was going to keep this secret until he was ready for announcement. His thin face was sad. So now I'm going to publish it myself in a deluxe edition, and I want you to illustrate it. I'd be honored, vowed Leverett, unable to believe it. I really like those drawings you did for the trilogy. I'd like to see more like those. As many as you feel like doing. I mean to spare no expense in publishing this. Oh, and those stick things. Yes? Scotty told me the story of those. Fascinating. And you have a whole notebook of them? May I see it? Leverett hurriedly dug the notebook from his file, returned to the manuscript. Dana paged through the book in awe. These are totally bizarre, and there are references to such things in the manuscript, to make it even more fantastic. Can you reproduce them all for the book? All I can remember, Leverett assured him, and I have a good memory. But won't that be overdoing it? Not at all. They fit into the book and they're utterly unique. No, put everything you've got into this book. I'm going to entitle it Dwellers in the Earth, after the longest piece. I've already arranged for its printing, so it begin as soon as you can have the art ready. And I know you'll give it your all. He was floating in space. Objects drifted past him. Stars, he first thought. The objects drifted closer. Sticks. Stick lattices of all configurations. And then he was drifting among them, and he saw they were not sticks, not of wood. The lattice designs were of dead pale substance, like streaks of frozen starlight. They reminded him of glyphics of some unearthly alphabet, complex, enigmatic symbols arranged to spell what? And there was an arrangement, a three-dimensional pattern, a maze of utterly baffling intricacy. Then somehow he was in a tunnel, a cramped, stone-lined tunnel through which he must crawl on his belly. The dank, moss-slime stones pressed close about his wriggling form, evoking shrill whispers of claustrophobic dread. And after an indefinite space of crawling through this and other stone-lined burrows, and sometimes through passages whose angles hurt his eyes, he would creep forth into a subterranean chamber. Great slabs of granite, a dozen feet across, formed the walls and ceiling of this buried chamber, and between the slabs, other burrows pierced the earth. Altar-like, a gigantic slab of gneiss waited in the center of the chamber. A spring welled darkly between the stone pillars that supported the table. Its outer edge was encircled by a groove, sickeningly stained by the substance that clotted in the stone bowl beneath its collecting spot. Others were emerging from the darkened burrows that ringed the chamber. Slouched figures only dimly glimpsed and vaguely human. And a figure in a tattered cloak came toward him from the shadow, stretched out a claw-like hand to seize his wrist and draw him toward the sacrificial table. He followed, unresistingly, knowing that something was expected of him. They reached the altar, and in the glow from the cuneiform lattices chiseled into the nice slab, he could see his guide's face, a moldering corpse face, the rotted bone of its forehead smashed inward upon the foulness that oozed forth. And Leverett would awaken to the echo of his own screams. He'd been working too hard, he told himself, stumbling about in the darkness, getting dressed because he was too shaken to sleep. The nightmares had been coming every night. No wonder he was exhausted. But in his studio, work awaited him. Almost 50 drawings completed now, and he planned another score. No wonder the nightmares. It was a grueling pace, but Dana Allard was ecstatic with the work he'd done, and Dwellers in the Earth was waiting. Despite problems with typesetting, with getting the special paper Dana wanted, the book only waited on him. Though his bones ached with fatigue, Leverett determinedly trudged through the graying night. Certain features of the nightmare would be interesting to portray. Okay, give me a break here. I gotta get up and plug in my phone before I forget for another 800 chapters in a row. Because I want it to be charged, I do. Oi, you heading for Baldur's Gate? Better make sure your phone is charged. Sorry, I'm normal. The last of the drawings had gone off to Dana Allard in Patersham, and Leverett, 15 pounds lighter and gut-weary, converted part of the bonus check into a case of good whiskey. Dana had the offset presses rolling as soon as plates were shot from the drawings. Despite his precise planning, presses had broken down. One printer had quit for reasons not stated. There had been a bad accident at the new printers, seemingly innumerable problems, and Dana had been furious at each delay. But production pushed along quickly for all that. Leverett wrote that the book was cursed, but Dana responded that a week would see it ready. Leverett amused himself in his studio constructing stick lattices and trying to catch up on his sleep. He was expecting a copy of the book when he received a letter from Steffroy. Have tried to reach you by phone last few days, but no answer at your house. I'm pushed for time just now, so must be brief. I have indeed uncovered an unsuspected megalithic site of enormous importance. It's located on the estate of a long prominent Massachusetts family, and as I cannot receive authorization to visit it, I will not say where. Have investigated secretly, and quite illegally, for a short time one night and was nearly caught. Came across references to the place in collection of 17th century letters and papers in a divinity school library. Writer denouncing the family as a brood of sorcerers and witches, reference to alchemical activities and other less savory rumors, and describes underground stone chambers, megalithic artifacts, etc., which are put to foul usage and diabolic practice. Just got a quick glimpse, but its description was not exaggerated. And Colin, in creeping through the woods to get to the site, I came across dozens of your mysterious sticks. Brought a small one back and have it here to show you. Recently constructed and exactly like your drawings. With luck, I'll gain admittance and find out their significance. Undoubtedly, they have significance, though these cultists can be stubborn about sharing secrets. We'll explain my interest is scientific, no exposure to ridicule, and see what they say. We'll get a closer look, one way or another. And so, I'm off. Sincerely, Alexander Steffroy. Leverett's bushy brows rose. Allard had imitated certain dark rituals in which the stick lattice is figured. But Allard had written over 30 years ago, and Leverett assumed the writer had stumbled onto something similar to the Man Brook site. Steffroy was writing about something current. He rather hoped Steffroy would discover nothing more than an inane hoax. The nightmares haunted him still, familiar now, for all that their scenes and phantasms were visited by him only in a dream. Familiar. The terror that they evoked was undiminished. Now he was walking through forest, a section of hills that seemed to be those close by. A huge slab of granite had been dragged aside, and a pit yawned where it had lain. He entered the pit without hesitation, and the rounded steps that led downward were known to his tread. A buried stone chamber, and leading from it, stone-lined burrows. He knew which one to crawl into. And again the underground room with its sacrificial altar and its dark spring beneath, and the gathering circle of poorly glimpsed figures. A knot of them clustered about the stone table, and as he stepped toward them, he saw they pinioned a frantically writhing man. It was a stoutly built man, with white hair disheveled, flesh gouged and filthy. Recognition seemed to burst over the contorted features, and he wondered if he should know the man. But now the lich with the caved-in skull was whispering in his ear, and he tried not to think of the unclean things that peered from that cloven brow, and instead took the bronze knife from the skeletal hand, and raised the knife high, and because he could not scream and awaken, did with the knife as the tattered priest had whispered. And when after an interval of unholy madness he at last did awaken, the stickiness that covered him was not cold sweat, nor was it nightmare, the half-devoured heart he clutched in one fist. Leverett somehow found sanity enough to dispose of the shredded lump of flesh. He stood under the shower all morning, scrubbing his skin raw. He wished he could vomit. There was a news item on the radio. The crushed body of a noted archaeologist, Dr. Alexander Steffroy, had been discovered beneath a fallen granite slab near Whately. Police speculated the gigantic slab had shifted with the scientists' excavations at its base. Identification was made through personal effects. When his hands stopped shaking enough to drive, Leverett fled to Petersham, reaching Dana Allard's old stone house about dark. Allard was slow to answer his frantic knock. "Good evening, Colin. What a coincidence you're coming here just now. The books are ready. The bindery just delivered them." Leverett brushed past him. "We've got to destroy them," he blurted. He'd thought a lot since morning. "Destroy them?" "There's something none of us figured on. Those stick lattices, there's a cult, some damn cult. The lattices have some significance in their rituals. Steffroy hinted they might be glyphics of some sort. I don't know. But the cult is still alive. They don't want their secrets revealed. They killed Scotty. They killed Steph-Roy. They're on to me. I don't know what they intend. They'll kill you to stop you from releasing this book. Dana's frown was worried, but Leverett knew he hadn't impressed him the right way. Colin, this sounds insane. You really have been overextending yourself, you know. Look, I'll show you the books. They're in the cellar. Leverett let his host lead him downstairs. The cellar was quite large, flagstoned and dry. A mountain of brown-wrapped bundles awaited them. Put them down where they wouldn't knock the floor out, Dana explained. They start going out to distributors tomorrow. Here, I'll sign your copy. Distractedly, Leverett opened a copy of Dwellers in the Earth. He gazed at his lovingly rendered drawings of rotted creatures and buried stone chambers and stained altars, and everywhere the enigmatic latticework structures, and he shuddered. Here. Dana Allard handed Leverett the book he had signed. And to answer your question, they are Elder Glyphics. But Leverett was staring at the inscription in its unmistakable handwriting. For Colin Leverett, without whom this work could not have seen completion. H. Kenneth Allard. Allard was speaking. Leverett saw places where the hastily applied flesh-toned makeup didn't quite conceal what lay beneath. Glyphics symbolic of alien dimensions, inexplicable to the human mind, but essential fragments of an evocation so unthinkably vast that the pentagram, if you will, is miles across. Once before we tried, but your iron weapon destroyed part of Elthol's brain. He erred at the last instant, almost annihilating us all. Elthol had been formulating the evocation since he fled the advance of iron 4 millennia past. Then you reappeared, Colin Leverett, you with your artist's knowledge and diagrams of Althol's symbols. And now, 1,000 new minds will read the evocation you've returned to us, unite with our minds as we stand in the hidden places, and the great old ones will come forth from the earth, and we, the dead who have steadfastly served them, shall be masters of the living. Leverett tried to run, but now they were creeping forth from the shadows of the cellar, as massive flagstones slid back to reveal the tunnels beyond. He began to scream as Elthol came to lead him away, but he could not awaken, could only follow. The end. Let's read the afterword. That's a fun one. Or I'm going to read the afterword. Some readers may note certain similarities between characters and events in this story and the careers of real-life figures, well known to fans of this genre. This was unavoidable, and no disrespect is intended. Good night, Crad. For much of this story did happen, though I suppose you've heard that one before. In working with Lee Brown Coy on Wellman's Worst Things Waiting, I finally asked him why his drawings so frequently included sticks in their design. Lee's work is well known to me, but I noticed that these sticks only began to appear in his work for Ziff Davis in the early 60s. Lee finally sent me a folder of clippings and letters, far more eerie than this story and factual. In 1938, Coy did come across a stick-ridden farmhouse in the desolate Manbrook region. He kept this to himself until fall of 1962, when John Vetter passed the account to August Derleth and to antiquarian archaeologist Andrew E. Rothavius. Derleth intended to write Coy's adventure as a Lovecraft novelette, but never did so. Rothavius discussed the site's possible megalithic significance with Coy in a series of letters and journal articles, which I have barely touched. In June 1963, Coy returned to the Manbrook site and found it obliterated. It is a strange region, as HPL knew. Coy's fascinating presentation of their letters appeared in 5 weekly installments of his, quote, Chips and Shavings column in the Mid-York Weekly from August 22nd to September 26, 1963. Rothavius, whose research into the New England megaliths has been published in many journals, wrote an excellent and disquieting summary of his research in Arkham House's The Dark Brotherhood, to which this reader is referred. And that's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. I liked it. I thought it was pretty good. Although I don't think it really gets better than the beginning, you know? I kind of get sad when a story is like that. Like when it's really good in the beginning and you're like, this rules, and then it kind of never gets better than the beginning. But it's probably just because when I saw the word lich on the page, like, I jumped up and, like, I, like, tore off my clothes, and there was, like, a cheerleader outfit underneath, and I had pom-poms under my desk, and it said lich across my chest in big letters, and I started, like, jumping around and kicking my feet into the air and sort of waving my arms about, that sort of thing, which caused a big mess, as to be expected. But what I'm saying is I may be a little biased as to which part of it I think the book, it never gets better than. But I really liked it. It is said to have been an inspiration for the Blair Witch Project. And it was recently a big inspiration for a work of my own, which some of you know about because it has been revealed to you, and some of you will find out about in the future. As always, thank you so much for joining us. I don't know what we will do next week just yet. We may start a book, or we may read another short story out of this collection if I find another one that I like this much. I feel like that might be fun, depending on how people felt about it, depending on, if that's something you guys are interested in. We could cover another story from this book. I would love that. The book, again, is Karl Edward Wagner's In a Lonely Place. Introduction by Ramsey Campbell. I believe it is a posthumous collection of his short stories. Styx, I believe, was written in the early 1980s. All right. I think we are switching over to ending time. Books in the cellar, dumbass. Yeah, that doesn't seem like a good idea. But he said they were wrapped up tight, right? Like in like some kind of packaging that you would use to ship them. You think that makes it okay? I wouldn't know anything about it. Oh, man. My mom made burgers last night. Why would you go to the cellar? Well, because of the big scary... For any reason. Well, he said it was because they were too heavy and he didn't want them to damage his floor. Because, like, the massive pile of books was too heavy. He wanted it downstairs where it wouldn't damage his... the floor might give out, he was worried. I'm making a fucking mess here trying to clean up, but just making a worse mess, dropping messy things on the clean surfaces and messifying them is what I'm doing while I talk. Eye roll. Jeez, have some fun. Have some fun. They had to go to the cellar because that's where the cult works. They work out of. They build big tunnels in the cellar. I'm sure he was going down to the cellar and he was like, "Wow, this is just like that cult that I'm really scared of. I'll go with you." It's like running up the stairs in a horror movie. Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I see that. But look, you gotta go to the cellar. The cellar is spooky. You gotta go there. Ugh. I have an awful taste now on my lips. On my tongue even. Yeah. Oh, it's really bad. I need to make some cereal or something. I feel like it's gonna have milk maybe to wash it out. Ugh. I made the mistake of tasting something that I should have just thrown away. Okay. Well, on that note, thank you so much, everybody, for listening. I had a great time reading this one. And like I said before, if you're a regular friend of the stream, if you're somebody I talk to, whether it's here on Twitch at twitch.tv/nickcastle, my full name with no spaces and no E at the end, or over on the YouTube channel, Chaos Grandpa Vivo, Stunt Fumbler, whatever dumb name I have for it right now, which can always be, which is always pointed to from the stream. If you're somebody who talks to me on there, if you're somebody who talks to me personally, and you would like to hear more stories from this book, let me know, because that would be great, and I would love to do that. But if you don't, if that's not super interesting to you, also feel free to reach out and let me know about that, and we'll do something else. in the next few weeks. We're doing a little bit of filler right now, where while I catch up behind the scenes. What I'm doing is I'm catching up on the books that are actually planned to finish this year out. But right now I'm not far enough in any of them to debut here. So these next few weeks we're coming up with a couple of filler episodes while I get that situated, settled out, get all that in order, and start my, get adjusted to starting my fall semester and stuff. So, on the bright side of that, I have a lot of room. If you have something short that you would like me to read while we're doing filler season right now, reach out to me, let me know. Other things I could read, other than more bits out of this book. Let me get up and look at my bookshelf and we'll see. So, I have literal, multiple books of short stories about the King in Yellow. I have collections of short stories it's set in the King of Yellow universe, dating from the 1800s when it came out to 2013. I have stories all from in there. But I know that doesn't really interest other people as much as it interests me. It's kind of a personal thing. But if you think that sounds cool, let me know. And, we can always do one or two, right? We don't have to do it for weeks and weeks. So that could be something we could read while we're doing filler. Lies, we made a zine. We did. It was pretty awesome. It was pretty cool. It was a pretty good one. But that was my King in Yellow short story, It wasn't like it was, Sir Colonel Mustard from 1921's King in Yellow story, which I feel like my friends might be less interested in than one that their friend made. You know what I mean? But if it's genuinely interesting to you guys, then we don't have to commit too many. We can do a few and see if we like it. So I think it's a good possibility. I always have Slaughterhouse-5, which I have not read on here. I just feel like everybody's read it. You know what I mean? But it's pretty short. We could do that. I would love to read from Wayne Barlow's Expedition, being an account in words and artwork of the 2358 AD voyage to Darwin 4, but it's a book that depends heavily on illustrations. The same way I haven't read All Tomorrows yet. I feel like it's illustrations are such a big part of it, Although All Tomorrows would be easier. That's something I've been considering coming around on, because it's not really that hard. There's to deal with the illustration side of that book. There's one per chapter, and I would just have to click through them like a slideshow. It wouldn't be that hard. That's a pretty short book. We could look into doing that maybe. It would take a little more setup on my end, but I would be more than willing. I don't know why I said that so dramatically. I would be willing to do it. I don't know why I said it all. I would be more than willing, Charles. What else? I've read Frankenstein. We could read Frankenstein. I didn't, I've never put Frankenstein on the list because I don't really feel like it's that good of a book. Where am I? Oh, I'm over by my bookshelf. My It doesn't. My fancy microphone. It doesn't follow me around. I'm looking at my bookshelf and trying to speak up so I can be heard. Frankenstein's also a little long. Oh God, he's in the cellar. You know, it's a short book that we could read that I haven't read in years and years and years, but that I have read all the way through. Is Brave New World. Let me know if you guys have any feelings about that. I thought that was a good book, but I was pretty young when I read it. I probably would understand it a lot more now. Cellar. I barely know her. I gotta turn off the recording. I'm pestering the shit out of YouTube people. They don't give a fuck at all about any of this. Okay, I'm sorry. YouTube people, good night. Thank you so much for listening to me read. Good night.